Fleet Admiral Vesik Korath had monitored Earth's final transmission for 6 months before authorizing the invasion fleet's approach, translated and retranslated by 3 separate linguistic divisions, each one arriving at the same conclusion his own confident strategic assessment had already assumed. Humanity's last broadcast, transmitted in the chaotic final hours before compact forces achieved full orbital dominance, represented an unconditional surrender. His forces entered Earth's atmosphere 11 months later, expecting to formalize a conquest already effectively complete. They found, instead, exactly what the signal had actually been trying to tell them, 17 minutes too late for the warning to matter. The signal itself had been broadcast from a hardened communications facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, transmitted continuously on every frequency compact monitoring equipment could detect, during the final chaotic hours when Earth's orbital defenses collapsed under sustained compact bombardment. Fleet Admiral Korath's Intelligence Division had recovered and analyzed the transmission extensively during the 11-month gap between the orbital campaign's apparent conclusion and the invasion fleet's actual planetary approach. A delay compact strategic doctrine required for thorough atmospheric and biological hazard assessment before committing ground forces to any newly conquered world. The signal's content in its final, officially translated form reads simply, "We are complying. Do not proceed further. You do not understand what you are walking into." Translation confirms unconditional surrender, reported Chief Linguist Thessa Voren, presenting the Compact's official assessment during the extensive pre-invasion briefing convened 3 weeks before the fleet's planned atmospheric approach. The phrase, "We are complying," represents unambiguous acknowledgement of defeat, consistent with standard surrender terminology our linguistic division has documented across numerous previous human military communications throughout the preceding conflict. The subsequent phrases, while somewhat unusual in their specific construction, appear consistent with typical psychological patterns documented among defeated populations, attempting to preserve some measure of psychological dignity in the immediate aftermath of military collapse, warnings and claims of hidden knowledge that our considerable prior conquest experience has documented as a common, ultimately insignificant feature of final, defeated transmissions across dozens of previous campaigns. Fleet Admiral Korath, whose own considerable 30-year conquest career had encountered numerous similar final transmissions across previous campaigns, accepted the linguistic division's assessment with the confident professional certainty that 11 months of careful, methodical post-campaign analysis had reinforced rather than genuinely questioned. The pattern is entirely consistent with our extensive documented experience, he confirmed, during the briefing's concluding assessment. Defeated populations frequently attempt to construct a final narrative of defiance or hidden strength, even in the moment of unconditional surrender, a psychological mechanism our considerable prior conquest doctrine has documented as essentially universal across sentient species facing genuine military collapse. This transmission's specific warning language represents nothing beyond this well-documented pattern. We will proceed with planetary occupation according to standard post-conquest protocol. What Fleet Admiral Korath's confident assessment and the considerable linguistic and psychological analysis that had reinforced it across 11 months of careful post-campaign review had genuinely failed to properly account for was the specific, deliberate ambiguity embedded within a transmission that Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human linguist and cultural analyst who had actually drafted the final broadcast during Earth's chaotic final defensive hours, had constructed with precise, calculated intention. "We knew by that point that the war was lost," she would later explain, in testimony recorded years after the invasion's actual, catastrophic outcome, addressing a compact historical commission specifically convened to understand exactly how their considerable 11 months of careful translation analysis had so thoroughly failed to properly interpret humanity's actual final message. Earth's orbital defenses were failing. We had perhaps hours left before compact forces achieved full orbital dominance, and every strategic calculation available to our command structure indicated that continued conventional resistance would produce nothing beyond additional, ultimately futile casualties. We made a decision in those final hours about what our last transmission should actually communicate, and we made it very deliberately, understanding that whoever eventually translated and analyzed that transmission would be doing so from an entirely different cultural and linguistic framework than the one that had actually constructed it. The phrase, "we are complying," Dr. Vasquez would eventually explain, had been chosen with specific, calculated precision, technically accurate in describing Earth's cessation of conventional orbital defense operations, while deliberately avoiding any of the standard, unambiguous surrender terminology that compact linguistic analysis, trained extensively on formal capitulation language across dozens of previous conquered species, had been specifically calibrated to recognize. We were complying in the narrow, literal sense that we had stopped fighting the specific battle your forces could actually see, she said. We were not surrendering, in the sense your species' considerable linguistic analysis assumed we meant, because surrender, as your compact's own extensive conquest doctrine defines it, requires acceptance of subsequent occupation and administrative control. We never accepted that. We simply stopped fighting a battle we had already lost, in order to preserve everything we had spent the preceding months building for the battle we had not yet lost, the one your forces would actually have to fight once you finally arrived on the ground. The warning embedded within the transmission's final phrases, "You do not understand what you are walking into," which compact psychological analysis had confidently classified as a common, strategically insignificant expression of defeated defiance, had, in fact, represented a genuine, specific attempt to communicate something Dr. Vasquez's own extensive cultural and linguistic expertise had understood, even in Earth's final desperate hours, was almost certain to be misinterpreted by an analytical framework built around entirely different assumptions regarding what final defeat actually meant. We could not explain, in a single brief transmission, exactly what we had spent the preceding months building, she said. We did not have the time, and even if we had, we understood that revealing specific tactical details would simply allow your forces to prepare countermeasures during the considerable gap we knew your own conquest doctrine would require before committing ground forces. So we chose our words very carefully, hopping, honestly without much confidence, that someone within your considerable analytical apparatus might recognize the deliberate ambiguity we had constructed, might understand that a species claiming full compliance while simultaneously warning their conqueror away represents an internal contradiction no genuinely defeated population would typically construct. We were not counting on you catching that contradiction. We were simply trying to be honest, in whatever way honesty was actually possible, given the constraints of that specific, desperate moment. We complied with what we could no longer prevent. We warned you about what we absolutely could. What Fleet Admiral Korath's forces encountered upon their eventual planetary approach, 17 minutes after entering the atmospheric range where Earth's remaining, carefully concealed defensive infrastructure activated in full, coordinated force, represented the same specific strategic pattern that had, across the preceding decades of human resistance against considerably more limited prior compact engagement, consistently produced results compact conquest doctrine had never adequately theorized. Earth's actual surrender of its conventional orbital defense capability had bought the planet's surviving population and remaining defensive infrastructure 11 months of uninterrupted, undetected preparation, time that compact strategic doctrines own considerable pre-invasion caution, ironically, had directly provided by requiring extensive atmospheric and biological hazard assessment before committing ground forces to any newly conquered world. The invasion fleet's catastrophic losses during the ground campaign's opening hours, documented extensively across subsequent compact military analysis that would eventually become required study across an entire generation of strategic planning, reflected precisely the specific warning Dr. Elena Vasquez's carefully constructed final transmission had attempted, within the severe constraints of that desperate final hour, to actually communicate. Fleet Admiral Korath's own formal report, submitted 3 weeks after an engagement that had cost his forces losses considerably exceeding the entirety of the preceding orbital campaign, contained an assessment that would become foundational to a complete restructuring of compact linguistic and psychological analysis doctrine regarding human final transmissions. Our linguistic and psychological analysis divisions classified humanity's final broadcast as consistent with standard defeated population communication patterns documented across dozens of previous conquest campaigns, he wrote. This classification proved catastrophically incorrect, not because our analytical methodology was inadequately rigorous by any conventional measure, but because that methodology was calibrated entirely around the assumption that a defeated population's final transmission would reflect genuine capitulation, regardless of whatever residual defiant language such transmissions typically contained. Humanity's final transmission was not a defeated population's final psychological gesture. It was a precisely, deliberately constructed piece of strategic communication, technically accurate in every specific phrase while simultaneously, deliberately withholding the actual strategic reality those phrases were carefully designed to obscure. I do not believe our analytical failure reflects inadequate linguistic expertise. I believe it reflects a fundamental miscalculation regarding what kind of species we were actually attempting to translate, one capable of constructing genuine, technically honest communication, specifically calibrated to be misunderstood by an analytical framework built around different cultural and strategic assumptions than the ones that actually produced it. Dr. Elena Vasquez, addressing the Compact Historical Commission convened years later to formally document the engagement's full strategic and cultural significance, offered a final reflection that would become, within subsequent compact diplomatic and military training regarding human communication, one of the most extensively studied principles in the entire post-war relationship between the two civilizations. I don't think what we did was deception exactly, not in the way your own doctrine probably still wants to categorize it, she said. Every single word in that transmission was true. We were complying with the specific reality your forces could actually observe and verify. We did warn you, as clearly as our circumstances allowed, about the reality we knew you would eventually discover regardless of what we said. We didn't lie to you, Fleet Marshal. We simply told you the truth in a way that required you to actually think carefully about what we were saying, instead of simply matching our words against whatever surrender template your analytical framework already expected to find. I think that's actually the most important thing your compact eventually needs to understand about humanity, if this relationship is ever going to move past the considerable damage that first invasion caused on both sides. We don't always tell you what you expect to hear, and we don't always make it easy to understand exactly what we actually mean. But we don't lie, not in the specific way your own doctrine seems to define lying. We just require you to listen considerably more carefully than you're apparently used to listening, and I think that first invasion taught your entire civilization, at very real and very permanent cost to both of us, exactly what happens when you don't. The engagement, eventually formalized within compact historical and military records simply as the 17-minute miscalculation, would become, across the following decades of gradually improving human compact diplomatic relations, one of the most frequently referenced cautionary examples in cross-species communication doctrine, a permanent reminder, taught to every subsequent generation of compact linguists and strategic analysts, that a species' willingness to tell the literal truth carried no guarantee whatsoever that the truth being told would be the one the listener assumed they were hearing.